Hi everyone, I'm Diana with Living on the Fault Lines, a place on the internet where we're talking about healing after loss, including the tragic loss of suicide. And the reason I'm talking about this is that 4.5 years ago, I found myself in the aftermath when my husband took his life. And with 3 young children, I found the aftermath, the legacy, the taboo, terrifying. So I began talking and writing about this experience as a way to shine a light on this subject. So today I'm really excited to be bringing on Raphael Cushnir. And Raphael is a leading voice in the world of emotional connection and present moment awareness. He has shared his unique approach to personal and professional development with millions of readers in O, the Oprah magazine, BeliefNet, Spirituality and Health, Psychology Today, and the Huffington Post. He is the author of 6 books, lectures worldwide, and is a faculty member of the Eastland Institute, the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, and the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies. In addition, he coaches individuals and teams at Fortune 100 companies, governments, religious organizations, and leading nonprofits. Raphael's own heart was opened by an experience of profound grief. So welcome, Raphael, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be with you.
So nice to have you here. And I found you through a really cool interview project that I came across with Tammy Simon in the Self-Acceptance Project. And your interview really, you shared some ideas that I just think would be really helpful to this audience in dealing with the aftermath of suicide and the darkness. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is just share ideas and different ways for people to think about healing in the aftermath. But before we get into that, I would love it if you would share maybe a little bit about your story with this profound grief that you've gone through and how you came to be doing this work.
Sure. Well, I think my whole life prepared me to be doing this work, and then what really catapulted me into it was the classic dark night of the soul, which I'm sure that most of your listeners and viewers can relate to through their own experience. In my case, what happened, this is about 20 years ago now, my personal and professional life really fell apart at the same time. And up until that time, I had been what I would say is a whippersnapper, meaning that I would use my intelligence to solve my problems. And the classic aspect of the dark night of the soul for me was that life had given me a problem that I couldn't solve. And that didn't mean that my brain stopped trying 24/7. It still did, but ultimately it had to surrender because it was clear that there was no way through that. And you know what I want to do is just in honor of your viewers is get to the heart of that quickly, because yes, a lot of us have dealt with infidelity and a lot of us have dealt with suicide, and in my case it was a suicide attempt from my wife at the time. But the key part of it for me that was the hardest was that after she disclosed the infidelity to me, I did what a well-therapized and hopefully conscious person would do. I said, let's go to our counselors, let's try to repair the container. And I found that you could only do that if both people are willing and able to do that. And at one point, and this is the key, what I said to my wife at the time, Linda, was, I said, when I married you, you became my family, and you don't get kicked out of my family unless you want to be. So I really want to know from you, what do you want here? What's your truth? And what she said was, all I want is to be with you, which may sound really crazy to you right now because I've left our marriage. I'm living with another man. But I actually feel that all these things that are happening to me are out of my control. And I imagine the two of us getting back together as like a kind of dim light at the end of a long tunnel. And I don't know whether it can ever happen. I would never ask you to wait for it. But since you asked me my deepest truth about what I want, that's it. Now, that was really harder than the affair itself. to be with. What am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to live? What does that look like? And what does this mean that you have no control over the situation? These were all the questions that my mind couldn't deal with at all. But what happened at that time for me that really was the seed of everything to come was that I decided that the one thing I didn't want to do was run away from the pain that I was experiencing. And I didn't know what to do with the pain, but I just felt like no matter what, I wasn't going to turn away from it. So that really began a period of 6 months of excruciating exploration. I still had a job and I exercised, but this darkness just went with me wherever I went. And every time I saw myself trying to run away from it or leave it on one track of thinking or another, I would just gently bring myself back. And I wasn't so great at it. I was kind of stumbling along. The fact that I had done a lot of personal work and spiritual work up until that point supported me to some degree, so I wasn't an absolute beginner, but still I felt awkward, I felt confused, I didn't really know where it was leading me, but it was the first choice that I made that created a possibility for everything good that came afterward.
That's great. I appreciate you saying that, because that's really, I think it's so key for people to understand that it isn't easy and that it's a choice. And I did very similar in the aftermath when I realized that I had this legacy to contend with, and that everything I was doing, to have gotten myself into that situation where I didn't really know a lot about myself or my life, that I needed to do things really differently. And I made that choice too, to really sit with the pain. And I think it's almost, like anything you do in life, whether it's running a marathon or learning a new instrument, there's the learning curve and the practice and the continuously coming back to. And it's so interesting because here we live in our bodies and we can be 50 years old and not have any idea who we are, what's going on in here at all. And I think that choice to really make the decision to stay with yourself, to choose yourself and to be with that pain is just so important, in getting through these things, particularly something with a suicide, where, one of the things that you talked about in your interview with Tammy was the idea of early wounding. And I think suicide intersects people at a place where they have so many wounds that they haven't addressed or thought about. And, they might have this belief that they're unworthy or that they've been abandoned or they're not deserving. And then somebody they love removes themselves from their life. And that belief just becomes, it becomes external. It isn't just in here anymore. It's actually out here in the public. And so we scramble and do everything we can to kind of keep that hidden. And that's where, a lot of the silence comes from. But I'd love it if you would speak a little bit, about this negativity bias, which is troublesome for, handling the aftermath, and then also the early wounding, kind of your experiences with that.
Sure. Well, I think, one of the things that is pretty consistent among the clients that I work with is that people are dealt a hand. Something happens, the worst thing they could imagine. And they've probably, before they gotten to me, have done some significant work on themselves, and they're still feeling kind of stuck. And what most people share after a while is, this wasn't supposed to be my life. And the idea is that if I didn't ask for this, I didn't choose it, and could you please help me get rid of it so that I could go back to having the life that I was meant to have? And the hard news part of this is that this is that life. This is the one we've got. And that if we actually decide to turn it into a path, then we have the opportunity to make it the greatest possible life and even blessing that it can be. But there is no jumping to another life, even if in our wish or a fantasy that would be the case. Once someone is either willing or broken open to that experience through their suffering, then they have a chance to look anew at the life that they've led till this point and to ask, what is this life? What has this life been about? What is it that I can really deepen into and heal from? And I think you're absolutely right that anybody who's touched by suicide or similar loss will have to see that while this event was not in their control at all, it shines a light on their whole journey to this point. And particularly, it shines a light on how they deal with their own pain, with their own wounding. Because we all have one or two or three kind of key stories that we run about our lives all the way back. So you mentioned one of being unworthy. And I think that that unworthiness is kind of the biggest virus, really, that I know of in the world, you know, broader than any of the diseases that people try to fight. You scratch the surface of even the most successful people, and it's right there, right under the surface. Somehow I'm undeserving. I'm bad. I'm wrong. Something about me just isn't right.
It's so weird, isn't it? I mean, it's a really, you know, I think Brene Brown talks a lot about this too with all of her work. And I remember, I think it was two or 3 years ago in therapy, I was doing this session. And all of a sudden I had that thing where I realized that my whole life had been, you know, lived out from behind the lens of I'm not worthy. And it was the weirdest thing. It was like finding, you know, like a dead animal in in your bed or something. I went, what? Wait a minute. I'm not worthy? And I really, all of a sudden, it was like everything connected together. And I went, oh my God, I've been making all my choices from this stance that I'm not worthy. I'm not a worthy human. And it's the weirdest concept, isn't it? And I think you're right. I meet a lot of very successful people. And right underneath that is that belief, which is part of, I think, why it's so difficult to heal after a suicide, because, you know, suicide magnifies that. We have, you know, somebody abandoned us, someone left us. And now we're left alone with that unworthiness.
Right, and actually you're touching on something that's really key, because there may be a period of time, and it could last a long time, where we look at the wrong that's been done to us. How could that person have done that to us? And so our focus is on them. But at some point, it's inevitable that we turn the focus back to us. And then sometimes when we do that, it's, how did I create this or co-create this? Or how did I have such a blind spot that I couldn't have seen this coming? And so then it becomes about us. And once that happens, it touches this place of wrong, bad, shameful, not enough. But it's really interesting that you used a kind of a colorful description that I want to start with and then move from. You talked about finding a dead animal in your bed. And I really get what you mean. It's just like, oh my God, you know, it's the shock and the horror to recognize that. But what's happened for most of us is that where we got hurt, a part of ourselves stopped growing and got stuck there, but stays with us and is very close by, like a breath away, but cannot be included in the wholeness of who we are at first, and that at first maybe for decades. But what I mean is that at first it's too painful. We don't know how. We can't address and include that part of us directly. So we carry it around, and it really is the proverbial baggage, so to speak. And when we're touched by such great pain and loss, we have a new opportunity to turn to those parts of us that were stunted and wounded and really left out of who we are, and to bring them back from exile. To me, this is the heart of emotional healing for everybody, which is to say the part of me that hurts the most, that I like the least, that I wish I could surgically remove, is actually the very road to my healing and fulfillment. And what I'm constantly telling people is that any forward movement that is for you, that is positive, that you are going to make from this moment forward, happens with that part of you, integrated, cared for, and loved. And without it, you're not going anywhere.
So just to go back to the, so people really understand this unworthy piece or undeserving or what, whatever that might be for you, the proverbial dead animal in the bed. It's something that happened at a time most likely that you were not consciously aware of. So maybe there was an event where you took on a perception, right? And you read that event as meaning that you were unworthy, and that just became a part of your being without you really, noticing it so much. And so we've carried this through our lives, and it's been kind of the rudder on our ship. But that unworthiness, the belief of, where it came from, I think for some people is really hard to grasp.
Well, it could be from divorce. It could be from living in a family with addiction. It could be from a family secret or secrets that have been unspoken but are in the air. It could be from parents passing their own pain onto their own children, having expectations. But the most important thing is that somewhere along the line, you as a child have been told that you need somehow to either to prove that you're lovable, or you need to somehow recognize that you're not.
Yeah. Oh, that hurts my heart. I mean, yeah.
And what, maybe to discuss this in the most helpful way, we need to talk about what's supposed to happen. By supposed to, I mean, like, what's the healthiest version?
Right.
Healthiest version is that as you're growing from infancy forward, you look into the eyes of your most important caregivers, and you see that they have a way to behold you such that you are always loved for who you are. It's nothing that you have to earn. And even though growing up includes lots of lessons, you fall down, you get up, your parents are there to try to help you be the best that you can. So it's not about permissiveness or making things easy. But basically, in your cells and your bones that you are always loved and that you are always enough. And with that confidence, you're able then to start stepping out on your own, taking risks, growing, but you have the foundation from which to launch.
Yeah.
And if anything interrupts that, you end up with your own version of the not enoughness that we've been talking about. And a lot of the not enoughness ends up for most of us being, I do need to earn this. If I just do it a little bit more, or if I just learn how to do it a little bit better, then finally I'll be okay. And it's that hook and that sort of reach that we're constantly striving to get to that place, which puts us in decades worth of tightness, resistance, because ultimately there is no place to get to like that through proving ourselves or fixing ourselves. Because ultimately the only healing comes from saying that we are, all parts of us are sacred and belong. And we need to learn how to essentially give those parts of ourselves what they didn't get.
Right. Okay. So we have somebody who's lost someone to a suicide, and they already have this running in their head. They've got the unworthy tape and this kind of thing. And then on the other side of that, we also have this negativity bias, which the brain has a natural inclination toward. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the first thing that I can do is describe it in a humorous way to make the point, and then we can elaborate on it. Many, many years ago, I was on a family vacation, and I knew about the brain's negativity bias, where we remember and we focus on and exaggerate the bad things, and they stick so much more than the things that we like, that we love, the good things. So if you want to reinforce the good, you have to make a conscious intention to do that. So at the end of this family vacation, I said to everybody, okay, let's go around and everybody say 3 things that you loved about this vacation. And we went around person to person. And when we got to my stepdaughter, she very happily took part in my exercise. And then as soon as we were done, she said with this look of absolute glee in her eyes, now can we talk about 3 things that we hated?
That's awesome. That's funny.
And so I saw in that moment how, you know, we even take a kind of perverse pleasure in finding the bad. And the bias it comes from evolution. We need to be able to see what's dangerous, what's damaging, to root it out so that we can survive. But it leaves us kind of hyper vigilant and also unable to see things as fully and as clearly as we might. So this is true. I mean, this isn't really talked about so much, but it's worth saying, is that memory is so different from any sort of recordable fact. And, you know, in families where there are more than one siblings, you can often find this out where 2 or 3 kids are talking about what happened when they were all, you know, little kids, and one says, that's not how it happened. It happened totally different. And they were all there for the events, but they remember them completely differently.
Yeah.
What happens with our memory is that every time we have a painful or negative memory, and we come back to it in our minds, we reinforce that story about ourselves and our past. And we also get farther away from other narratives that might have been very close by. And so over time, we take a broad array of our experience and lose that to something that is more singular and also negative. So for me, for example, you know, in my life, I think that I had one big story, and I've come as an adult, as a healed or healing adult, to call that story "No Good Deed Goes Unpunished." Because it wasn't that I was, you know, punished for things that I recognized maybe were imperfect about myself. But it seemed like oftentimes I would get the short end of the stick. I'd be rejected, unloved, for the very things in me which I felt were the best. I was trying my hardest. I was doing what I thought was good, and in those cases, somehow I would be punished for it. So that's a really powerful story, and it comes up in my life all the time, even now as I'm really fully aware of it. But what I'm also aware of is that I don't have access to all kinds of other aspects of what was going on at that time in my life. And therefore, if I believe too strongly about that story, if I hold to it as an identity, this is who I am, this is what my life is about, then I'm choosing to suffer unnecessarily. So what I want to do is reclaim that part of myself. Really, as I said, bring in from exile the part of myself that lives that story, feels that pain. But I also want to be able to hold it in a loving parental awareness that isn't hooked by it or lost within it. And the way I do that, and this is really key for our talk today, is first I feel it in my body as an actual physiological experience. For some people it might live in their heart, for some people it might live in their belly. But I learn to actually turn to and open to that felt experience. And then I also learn, this is the second part, to separate from the verdict connected to that feeling. Because the verdict is a thought, is a belief, is a story, which is neither true or untrue fully. But what is real and undeniable is the feeling itself. But the key and the most positive aspect of this is when I turn, difficult though it is, to the visceral sensation inside of me that gets elicited by that wound. Not only do I heal, which literally means to come together, to mend, to bring back into wholeness, not only does that happen, but also when I do that directly, my thoughts don't need to project the previous wound in the same way that they did before. And therefore, that verdict starts to lessen in its intensity and also its frequency. And even when it comes in that less intense or frequent version, I don't get tangled up in it so more. It's much more like, oh, there's that, rather than that's my fate, I'm doomed. It's the truth of my miserable existence.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the counterintuitive thing to do, which is to stay with the pain, whether it's with your childhood belief of being unworthy or your story that you're talking about, with this latter part. How does that look to you? Like when you say viscerally, for somebody who has really spent their whole life kind of running away from these emotions, and I know you have, a couple different processes that you use, but how does that really look for somebody who's lost someone to suicide and who's, just stepping into these waters of not wanting to live at the mercy of, outside judgment, because there's a lot of that with this, but who does really want to take a step on that path towards coming into wholeness again? What does that look like? Sitting there in that feeling of somebody has, the story abandoned you or done this to you, which is a lot of the story about suicide. Can you kind of walk people through that?
Sure. Well, first there's the metaphoric version of it. It's a phrase, and it's even been a book title that I love. It goes like this: when you're falling, dive. And that's the counterintuitive part, right? It's like turning into the skid, and everything in us wants to run, go the opposite direction. Stop this. I want to stop falling. But at a certain point, when I realize there's no ground beneath me right now, the best thing I can do is actually go with and dive into this experience that I'm having. But your question, which is so important, is about the how. How do I do that? Once I recognize that that's really the best shot I have here, how do I do it? And the first thing to recognize in the how is that there are only 3 realms in which we can be aware throughout our life. There's what's happening outside of us, the external realm. There's the realm of our thoughts, and there's the internal realm in which we have internal physical sensations. Most of us are the least familiar with and the least comfortable with that internal realm. We only go to our body when it is doing something we don't like. There's an ache or a pain that we want to get rid of, or we don't like how much we weigh, or it's not performing for us. When there isn't a, quote, problem with our body, we tend not to be paying much attention there. So the biggest shift that somebody can make during a period of loss and the healing that comes after is to say, I'm going to become more aware and more at home inside of my physical body. The reason for that is that that's where all emotions arise, move and shift, and ultimately depart. If you want to feel what you're feeling, if you want to dive in the way that we were talking about a moment ago, you have to do it inside your body. There's no other place that this happens. So once you're willing to do that, then you realize that as you pay attention to whatever you're experiencing, it could be wrenching grief or a headache, but the thing that previously has seemed static and just awful, and that's it. Suddenly when you start paying attention up close and also patiently, you start to see that everything within you is always moving and shifting and changing. And it's only when you say no to the experience that it gets frozen and stuck. So once you start noticing up close and over time, you start to see that even your most searing pain, it rises and falls. It comes forward and grabs you, and then it recedes. Then it's incredibly intense, and for a split second, it's not there. And as all of that becomes your experience, you also recognize that when you ride those waves of experience, even the big ones, even the most intense and painful ones, that once you take that ride, even for just a few minutes, they take you, so to speak, to shore. You feel more present, more open, more connected to yourself, and actually more peaceful, even if some of those same feelings are still present. So that's a first description of the how and the why you'd want to do that.
And so that's great. I think that's helpful. And what do emotions want in you know, as far as you've found with the things that you've done? I think a lot of people find emotions, and you know, we see people flying off the handle and getting angry, and you know, all these different things. And what do you think that they're really there for? The purpose of, you know, particularly the darker emotions, you know, or the ones that we've, you know, sort of put off limits, as, you know, anger and jealousy and rage and these different things. You know, what is there? Do they contain messages? When you get to that point that you're talking about, where you said you're at home in your body, what are we looking for?
Well, I think that's a really great question, and it's often overlooked. It's as if we already have the owner's manual for these emotions, and you know, we don't. But the simplest way to describe it is that all emotions need to be felt. That's what they want. And when they are felt, the message that they've sent has been received. And once the message is received, there's no need for the emotion, so it dissipates and it leaves you in a more open and present state. So it's really important to recognize, though, that the message isn't something you're supposed to understand. Maybe insight comes through the process or later, but by the message, I just mean the feeling itself in your body. That's the way that the human feedback system works. So, for example, when you're in the depths of despair about, let's say, a suicide, that is your reality. You know, the pain is basically saying, unbearable hurt. And you could run from that, or you could medicate that. But it's actually the experience that you're having. And over time, as you start to practice connecting to your experience in this way that we've been touching on, you start to see that your deepest, truest, best answer to whatever experience you're having is a yes. So we say, and this too. We don't have to like it. We don't have to want it. But it's what's real. It's the life we're having in this moment. And when we embrace it, there's a solace that comes, even amidst what feels intolerable. And one of the best images for that is those classic where the African American women are holding and trailing behind the casket, and they're wailing. And their grief is unbound. And also, those are the grievers who will heal the fastest and will heal the easiest, because they're saying yes at every step along the way. And this is a message that can only be heard in different degrees depending on where you are in your journey. So I wouldn't want anybody to think, as they're going through healing from the suicide of a loved one, that they need to embrace any of this any more than they're ready to.
Right, absolutely.
But when I went through some of the loss that I went through, and by the way, you know, in my experience, I've learned that comparison is the devil. There's always somebody who's lost more or worse and less, but your pain is your pain, and that's all that matters. And in my situation, as I finally accepted and allowed and surfed that grief, I started, first of all, to recognize that I had never grieved before. And the grief over the big loss brought up all the ungrieved other losses. And I didn't realize that there actually, and this almost sounds sacrilegious to say, that there was a satisfaction in the grieving. Grieving is paradoxically horrible and also soulful. And at a certain point, after I'd been through some of the worst waves of it, I was going to have an experience that some of my friends and loved ones felt was risky for me emotionally. And it brought to mind another title. Somehow my mind sticks with titles. It's a title of a novel that I've never read, but I bet is really good. It's called I've Been in Sorrow's Kitchen and Licked Out All the Pots.
Oh, that's good.
Why that touched me was I felt like because I had gone with the wave of my grief and didn't die, that somehow I could be with so much more than I ever imagined before. And all these people were worried about my fragility. But in fact, I felt stronger than I had ever been before. And we sometimes talk about being stronger in the broken places. And that was definitely true for me. And I think it's true for many people. We feel like, well, one more book title. It's a book about meditation. It's called Full Catastrophe Living.
You come across that.
The idea isn't that we are going to go out and seek the catastrophes. The point is they come in one form or another eventually. So if I say yes to that, then I'm not bound by any condition. I'm not saying that in order to be whole and healthy and to experience well-being, that my life has to look a certain way, that it's dependent on any conditions. And I think that that is the ultimate gift that moving in this way through loss gives us, is it frees us from the story that our lives have to look in any particular way in order for us to experience peace.
Wow. Yeah, that's very true. And it is, the emotions, I had similar experiences where, when I finally surrendered and said, okay, I'm just going to be with this. I'm not going to run anymore. And I first started feeling these emotions. What I found was every time I really let myself go into that and had that curl up in a ball moment, screaming, crying on the floor, that afterwards it was as though that dark energy had, there was room for other things inside me. I think grief and all of these energies that come when you lose someone or something, they tend to be very heavy. And when I've met people, and I've met so many of them over the last 4.5 years who've told me that when I've shared my story, they'll say, oh, my mother, father, brother, sister killed themselves 10, 20, 30 years ago, and we've never talked about it. Literally, the family has never talked about it. And I just always have this image of, you can tell because they're very rigid, these people. They just kind of have a frozenness to them. And that energetic, just density sitting in your family and, trying to work around it and everything else, it always just breaks my heart. And I think once you start feeling these things like you're talking about, it creates, I feel like I have a full spectrum now, whereas before I kind of had happy and sad, and now I feel like I have all the little pieces, the keys in between, that make up the rest of the emotions that we're supposed to be feeling.
I really appreciate the way that you're describing that. And in Buddhism, they say pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And the suffering is resistance to the experience that we're having. And the darkness that you're describing is the original pain met with resistance. Because the emotion that needs to be felt, that we were describing earlier, when it's not felt, does not go away. It stays in our body, now as a part of our unconscious. And it's still dying to get our attention. And that's where the stress comes from. That's where the illness comes from. That's where the repeated negative patterns, the addiction, the compulsion, that's where all of it comes from. So, the pain gets a bad rap because the pain is a wave that's a part of life that moves through us and can be served and can take us to that broader range of feeling that you described, and also take us to a strength and a resilience that we wouldn't have otherwise. So it's not the pain, it's the resistance that creates more and more darkness and tightness that you were describing. And my heart breaks also when I see that in anybody, because I've been graced with the opportunity to learn this work and to really take it as deeply as possible. And the thing that is also really important to share is that there's no getting there. There's no place that someone is supposed to get to. Like, if I just do my healing enough, if I just practice this surfing my emotions enough, then I'm going to be okay. Then that bad stuff isn't going to happen to me. Because actually it's the opposite. In my experience, it all still happens. But every time it happens, I have the opportunity to say yes a little more fully and be a little bit more curious and inclusive of what's happening. And that feels to me like the freest way to live. And so, the first book I wrote many years ago ended up being titled Unconditional Bliss. And it wasn't the happy, cheap version of bliss that kind of became popularized over the years. What I meant is that there's a fundamental radiance and joyfulness and peace in living that is available to all of us no matter what happens. And that's the gift. But that gift is available right now to everybody, even in the worst of their pain. And it's as close as your next breath. And it's not easy. And I would never underestimate the challenge and the courage that it takes. But really, it's as simple as saying yes to what is here right now. That's all you ever have to do. And you only have to do it in this moment. You don't have to promise that you're going to do it 5 minutes from now, or a day from now, or a week or a month from now. You only have to do it with what's right here, right now.
And I think that's really beautiful that you point that out, because, the challenge with suicide, I think, healing after a suicide, is you have the grief. And with suicide, it doesn't, it's tricky because, with a murder or with a disease or an accident, there's a perpetrator, as if you will, for lack of a better word, but we like to blame things. And so there's something that caused this. And then in suicide, the perpetrator is the person that you loved. And so this grief is really complicated by, trying to find a peaceful way to find resolution with that. And I think what you're talking about really, it brings permission. Like, there's a huge, it's like people need to be given a permission slip for this thing that's happened, because suicide, we tend to make it mean something about us. It becomes like bad mommy, bad spouse, bad parent. And, our society is very judgmental, unfortunately. And we're judging ourselves thanks to the negativity bias and all these other things. And then you have outside forces judging you. And what I love about what you're saying is, I think when you just do it in that moment and you can start coming back every day, and it's not easy. I mean, there are no 5 easy steps. When I first started this journey, people would say, just distill it down to 5 easy steps. Well, there isn't, and there's no magic pill. This is something that you have to decide you're going to do, and you just keep showing up every day and every minute. And I think what I love about what you just said is it really gives people that permission to just be in that moment. That's all you have to do, is just be in that breath, be in that moment, and just keep going forward with that.
Yeah, and I think that there are so many different ways that suicide happens, from a tragic accident to something that was absolutely purposeful. But in all the work that I do with people, it seems that it's really important to start to look at the distinction that we make between can't and won't. And what I mean by that is that if we think that somebody had a choice, then we consider them a perpetrator.
Mm.
And if we think they didn't have a choice, we think of them as a victim.
Mm.
And in this judgmental society, we tend to honor and support victims and blame and shun perpetrators.
Right.
But if we step out of right, wrong, good, bad, which are labels that we make and that we sort of add strength to over time, if we step out of those labels, then we have an opportunity just to say, this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not mine to know so much around that. And ultimately, if it could have happened differently, it would have. So it happened this way. And if I start with that, and I step away from having to assign some kind of judgment or blame or label or responsibility, then I can actually have my own experience. So for example, if I'm not stuck in blame, I may still be furious. And riding the wave of that fury is what's going to heal me and set me free. I may be resentful. I may hate. But all of those are felt experiences that we can move with and through in our bodies and that can bring us to peace. But anytime that we're looking to assess blame and responsibility, either outside or inside, ultimately we're lost. And there's no way out of that to any kind of resolution. So it's true that humans in general and our society in particular is built on blame. But once we recognize that that's a road to nowhere, then hopefully we have an opportunity to step into our experience rather than keep abstracting and pulling away from our experience because of the, what I would say, the false temporary satisfaction that comes from assigning responsibility, or, and not just responsibility for what happened, but for my pain.
Where do you think that, propensity comes from in our society to blame and to, point that outwards? I mean, is it just they don't have the capacity to hold their own pain, but this judgment, and it is so rampant in the suicide, bubble, unfortunately, to be judged, and the blame thing. Where does that come from, do you think, in humans?
Well, I believe that all resistance, saying no to what is actually resistance to our emotions. And we resist things that make us feel bad. And our first instinct is to react. And in reacting, what we're attempting to do unconsciously is offload or outsource our pain. If I make you wrong, and if I can punish you somehow, then I won't have to feel what I feel. So it's a survival instinct at first. And that's why the diving that we were talking about before and the surfing is counterintuitive also. Because we haven't talked about this, but the primitive part of our brain actually can't distinguish between an external threat like footsteps in a dark alley and an internal threat like grief. So it actually perceives difficult emotions as life-threatening. And, one part of our brain, as we talked about earlier, is saying, feel this. And the primitive part of our brain is saying, not a chance in hell. That is not going to happen for the purposes of our survival. So we start out cross-wired in that way. And that leads to many, many challenging things, including this penchant for blame and responsibility. But once we actually are willing to start feeling what we feel, then we move from reacting to responding. And responding means making conscious choices about how to move forward. And it's something that we have to learn, because evolution gave us these brains, And evolution moves forward in sideways fits and starts. It's not a straight line. And so we've inherited, I should say, these brains that are cross-wired. But the fabulous surprise is that we also have the opportunity to rewire them, to make it so that the primitive brain updates and starts allowing us to feel more fully, so then we're not stuck in reactive cycles. But if you look around the world, we're not there yet, because pretty much all the strife that you see is all about reacting, and it's reacting to difficult internal emotions, whether we're blaming a country, a leader, whatever is the cause that we're rallying behind. We're not free to pursue the world that we want consciously as long as we're reacting. Once we're able to respond consciously, think of, just for a moment as we're talking about the world stage, think of people marching for civil rights, arm in arm, singing "We Shall Overcome." As the fire hoses are turned on them, they are actually standing in love for each other, which is the opposite of reactivity. And that's a power that can't be stopped. It's a power that can't be stopped externally, and it's a power that can't be stopped internally as well.
Wow. Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's so true that, just going back to this whole thing of feeling your emotions, I've found just spending time with them over and over again, meditating and, really, really being there with them, you find yourself being less reactive. It's just a natural byproduct of allowing all of these things to move through you, isn't it? Just sort of, you're not afraid of them. And the emotions, for me, have become more of an ally now. I know when I'm feeling things, I can observe it. And I think of them really kind of as young children. Children are always clamoring for our attention in one way or another. And if you can look upon them as, children just trying to get your attention and needing nurturing, it really changes the face of them being so scary, I think.
Well, I love that image, especially because so often what young children think they want is really different from what they do want. And parents know that. So I like to talk about the parental stance of what I call strong arm, soft heart. So the soft heart is the compassion, which is ultimately what anyone needs, especially, in this case, these fragile young emotions. They just need to know they're okay. You've got them, right? There's a place where they can fall apart and be held. But the strong arms part comes in when you recognize and you share with that part of you, I've got you, but I'm also holding you strongly enough so that you're not going to hurt yourself or other people. And that often gives someone the opportunity to really kick and scream if that's what they need to do, or fall apart in a puddle if that's what they need to do. Because there's an awareness there that's holding them that isn't going to get lost in them. And, I once was doing work at a retreat, and there was a woman whose mother had committed suicide when she was 7. And she talked about the story endlessly. But she came to the workshop because she said, I've never really felt it. I really want to feel it. And what we did in the workshop was she actually had my assistant lie down as if it was the coffin, and she knelt down next to the coffin and spoke directly to her mother. And in that experience, as you might imagine, if she's held on to this for 3 decades, she started to lose it. And at one point I asked her, I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "No." And all eyes in the room at that time turned to me, like, what are you going to do? She's not okay. And what I knew and understood is that there wasn't a fix in that moment. There wasn't a control that needed to be exerted. What had to happen was that she had to know that I could hold her in the place that she was, which meant be with her, resonate with her, without getting lost in it with her, without panicking, without thinking there's something wrong with the experience that she was having. So in this really sacred moment for both of us, I was just saying over and over again, I'm right here with you. Can you feel my hand? Can you feel your feet? Can you feel your breath? Okay, let's take it one moment at a time. You're okay. I'm right here.
Yeah.
And in that moment, she was able to come back to herself and move through and release, ultimately, that which had been really just so deeply, tightly held within her. So I was enacting the strong arms and soft heart that I was just describing right there. And when we can do that for ourselves, I would say we have the most important human skill there is.
Yeah, super important. And what a great gift to be able to...
I'm jumping in, I'm sorry to interrupt,
That's
but
okay.
I want to say that we also are not meant to do that alone.
I was just going to say.
All the time, or even most of the time. I still work with someone to hold the space for me. So it isn't like we graduate to like, I don't need support for that.
I'm good, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was going to just clarify, because I think those emotions are huge, and they're really scary, and particularly if they've been sitting there. You know, I think one of the saddest things with suicide is that we not only take our own healing and fold it up, we also take the person and kind of fold their life and everything up, and we put them away, and it's almost as though they didn't exist anymore. So these are really big, powerful energies that are coming out that we're dealing with, and so super important to have somebody to walk through it with you. And then also, you know, to be doing this work, I think, on your own, to develop these capacities to hold all this stuff, because it's almost like a muscle, isn't it? You have to keep exercising it and building it. And I've found that, you know, over the 4.5 years of doing this, you just become more and more able to be present, and that you don't get washed away with it like you do in the beginning. And sometimes you do, but you know there's going to be an end to it, and that you're going to ultimately be safe.
Yeah, and I'm just inspired to add one thing, which is that, because this has happened a number of times when I've worked with people who've dealt with suicide or similar kinds of losses, is that very often in the first session that I have with them, or the second, there will come a time when they ask me, you know, when am I going to get over this? Like, how long is this going to take? And the answer that I give to them, heart and soul, 100%, is never. You will never get over this.
Yeah.
Getting over this is not the goal. And at first you might think, well, then they'd run away. Like, well, what the hell am I paying you for? But actually, for every person I've ever said that to, there's a palpable relief, a recognition that the experience is so overwhelming that it's always going to be with them. And other people have been sort of sharing with them, they need to do this, they need to do that.
Yeah.
And they take that on. And somehow, if it's 3 months or 3 years later and I'm still a mess, it's my fault because I haven't done something that I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
And so if we start from that place of, this is a searing tragedy that is always going to be a part of the fabric of your life, then we can start to do the work that you and I have been talking about today.
Right.
And, you know, going back to those young parts that got stunted or wounded or both along the way, once we get to this level of the profound acceptance that we're talking about today, we realize, wait, if we keep pushing those parts of ourselves away, we are doing to ourselves the same thing that was done to us, which is the last thing we ultimately want to do. And so, you know, just going from this to this about our wounded selves and about our current selves and the pain that we're experiencing around the suicide or the loss is everything.
So true. I love that, going from this to this. That's really, you know, quite beautiful, because I think most people go through their lives, you know, with feet and hands put out, right? Just resisting everything.
Yeah, and I also someone will tell me something about their own pain that they're resisting, their own negative patterns, their own self-destructiveness, and I'll hear the kind of fierce condemnation that they have for themselves. And what I'll try to model, and I'll even say it out loud, is I'll say, when I hear you talk about that and I recognize the pain that's behind that behavior, my first thought is, oh, honey, come here. Come here, let me be with you. And, that's the healing place. And sometimes we need others to help us get there and stay there, and sometimes we strengthen the muscle and we can do it most of the time ourselves. But that's the difference. And every single person who can't do that for themselves yet knows what that is, because there's someone or something in their lives that they actually already do that for. It could be their own child, it could be their pet, but unless they're, sociopathic, which is a very, very, very small amount of people, and not the people who are watching this right now, then they know that response. They know the, oh, wow, compassionate response. They just haven't given, coming back to your word from earlier, they haven't given themselves permission to direct it to them.
There's so much vulnerability, isn't there? I mean, we all want to be seen, felt, and heard. And I know when I tell my story and someone will say, I can always tell that, they have suicide. There's sort of a visible relief, and they'll tell me their story. And then, inevitably we hug. And there's just this, I'm very maternal anyway, but it's just that sense of, oh, honey, like you just want to hold them, because the pain is so palpable. And it just is so sad. It breaks my heart, which is why I really appreciate being able to talk to people like you, to share these kinds of ideas. And I could talk to you all day, but I've probably taken up enough of your time for now, and maybe we can continue with this. But I'd love to talk to you just my theory about connection, because one of the things suicide does is it really severs our connection. It severs our connection with ourselves, with our tribe, and also with our loved one. And I think the epidemic to me represents something much larger. When we have 1 million people a year on the planet killing themselves, I think there is this, it's begging us to sort of look at how we connect with ourselves and with each other. And in that vein, is there anything else that you'd like to share, in terms of really giving how people really connect with themselves? Because I think when we connect with ourselves, then we're able to look out and really connect with the rest of the world. But anything that you'd like to share with that?
Well, I think that there's a great paradox in everything that we've been exploring today, and that is that vulnerability is actually the source of our greatest power. That when we, and by vulnerability, at first I mean just self-vulnerability, the ability to connect to what is happening within us, especially the most difficult and fragile aspects of that, gives us the opportunity to live with what is courageously, and then to meet others from that place. So what you just described, which is absolutely true, which is that suicide ruptures connection. The opposite is also true, that it creates an opportunity for a connection that was never even available before, if we're willing to become vulnerable, first and foremost to ourselves, and then selectively to others who we sense can really hold and value and respect that. So, I had an experience recently where I had to share something that was really vulnerable to me with a loved one, and I did it in that way that's almost childlike, where I was like, I need to kind of talk to you between fingers and barely even be seen as I'm sharing this. But as in most cases, when you're dealing with people who really care about you, the experience brought us closer. It didn't separate us. And so it was my willingness to stay with what was vulnerable inside and then to share it that allowed the opportunity for that deeper connection to happen. And that is the power of vulnerability. And that's what we need in order to connect.
Yeah. And sharing it really from from that place of truth instead of, isn't this disgusting? Like, this is a part of me. This is that. Like, really being open to it. Like you said, I love that. Like a child of, this is who I am, because we all have these currents running through us. I mean, that are so similar, and I know it from when people, tell me their stories. There's just that relief. It's like, oh, you've got that too. You have that same kind of stuff. We all have these same things going on deep down, right?
Right. And also, because of the way we're made, sometimes it really is necessary to say, as we're going to share something vulnerable like this, please remember, I'm not looking for you to fix this. And I'm not looking for advice. I'm just looking for you to stay with me and connect with me as I share this difficult piece. And that's true when we turn within, as well as when we're with somebody else who is supporting us. That we want so badly to help people feel better. And what I always tell people about this is that I'm not here to help you feel better. I'm here to help you feel more. Through that process, you'll feel better. But we can't make that the goal. Because if we make that the goal, we squish and turn away from what actually needs to be embraced.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm really glad you brought that up, because people want to fix. We're fixers. I know, the first few days and weeks after my husband's death, people come up and it's just immediately like, they're not really listening to you. They're trying to jump in and see how they can make you feel better. And it's good intentions, but I think what you said is lovely about just be here with me. Just let me say this. And I've written about that on my blog. Of people call me all the time and say, what do I do? My friend's husband just committed suicide. And the best thing you can do is just be there and let them unfurl. Let this experience, begin to come out in the open, and don't try to fix it. Don't try to solve it, because you can't. You really can't. So
yeah, I think it's actually almost assaultive in those moments when someone wraps it up for you.
Oh, it's
when
awful.
Someone, the Lord had a plan for him.
Oh, God. That's a big one.
Yeah. Any other version of that is like, oh, I see what's happening is that you can't handle the enormity of this painful mystery, so you are wrapping it up and putting it away in such a way that you don't have to address it directly. But, that's not at all what I need.
Right. So important. So, Raphael, where can people find you if they want to work with you or learn more about what you do in the world?
So my website is Cushnir.com. That's my last name, which is Cushnir. And my email address is rc, my initials, at Cushnir.com. And anybody who is watching this and wants to reach out to me, I'd be happy to read your emails. I'm the only one who reads my email. They're private and confidential, and I'd be happy to engage with you that way. And on my website, there's tons and tons of information for free, as well as lots of information about the books and the online learning programs that I have. So those would be the two places, emailing me and just perusing the website as a start.
Very cool. Yeah, it is a great website. I did lots of reading. So, well, very cool. I really appreciate you spending some time with me. It has been, I think, very illuminating and hopefully helpful for people. So I'm glad you were able to spend some time here, and hopefully we can do it again and maybe, sort of go into some other deeper topics too. But I really appreciate it.
That would be great. And thank you again so much for doing this great work.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, take care.
Okay.
Thanks.